Hello and welcome to this rather foolishly named Basics video. This was supposed to be a simple explanation of some of the basic rules and mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but it kind of spiraled out of control a little bit and has ended up being, I think it was in total 44 minutes long by the time I'd finished. So I've cut it into two videos. This first one pretty much just sticks to dealing with the role-playing side of things before you get into combat, and covers that and a few little diversions, and then look out for part 2, which will delve into combat. Hello and welcome to BBDD's Dungeons & Dragons. Hopefully the sound quality of this video should be significantly better than my last few due to my fancy new Rode microphone, which I've just bought for myself and I'm still testing out. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about basics, and when I say basics I mean literally the nuts and bolts of sitting down and either running or playing an adventure. I'm going to touch on both sides, from being a player and from running a game yourself, but only in kind of basic terms, if I can possibly limit myself to basic terms. For a lot of people, if you've played much D&D, this is probably going to be fairly unnecessary information. But if you're similar to me, when I started, I could kind of get a theoretical concept of how the game was supposed to work, but actually sitting down and playing it, I was still a bit fuzzy on. I think mainly this is because of the way I learn is very kind of practical and tactile. I like to actually experience it and learn it whilst experiencing it. And so sitting there reading all the rules and watching videos online and trying to gather as much information gave me some confidence to start, but I still found myself quite fuzzy on the actual day-to-day details of running and playing a game. And if you are anything like me, this might be holding you back from starting or beginning or kind of having that confidence to try, and that would be a shame because it is actually quite simple to play. It gets more complicated as you learn more about it, and you can make it quite complicated if you want, but the very basics of role-playing games are actually pretty simple to pick up. And in fact, they're so simple, as long as you've got some of the rules, particularly of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, in your mind, you can pretty much play it anywhere, which is why I've taken to the habit of carrying around a set of dice and a notebook with some rules in it for various games and even a map, so that basically should the opportunity arise, I could possibly play it just out anywhere really. If there's a bored moment or a group of people that you want to entertain, you could actually run a very simple game literally anywhere, because all you really do need is 7 dice, if that, or a dice rolling app, and you're away pretty much. Obviously, if you want a really complicated and a long-running and kind of persistent story, you do need time and preparation, and there's all sorts of extra rules and details that you can add in which make the game more interesting and more mechanically satisfying, but the real basics of it are pretty simple. So the first bit is the basic role-playing, before we get into any combat, which is where it gets a little bit more number-noodly and complicated on that front. So the basic role-playing bit, this involves the Dungeon Master talking to their players and telling them, for example, okay, you've arrived in the small town of Grey Rock. There's a few shops dotted around and a small wooden keep up on a hill above the town. And that's basically as much description as you need. Obviously, there could be more description. It could be more elaborate or more detailed. There could be adventure hooks laid into the description that the Dungeon Master gives of the location. For example, you arrive in this town and off to your side down an alleyway you hear an odd sound. It could be, again, as simple as that, or it could be more complicated. But once the Dungeon Master has described the scene, the players can then basically do whatever they want. There isn't any turn-taking during the role-playing bit. It all is kind of assumed to be happening at the same time. The DM will basically be in charge of sequencing events and making sure that events kind of make sense, but the players can pretty much do whatever they feel they want to do, and all they have to do is say, okay, then I go and look for shops, or I go and pet a cat. They can literally choose whatever they wish to do. If they decide to talk to an NPC, then the Dungeon Master then will become that NPC, and the player and the Dungeon Master will have a conversation, preferably in character, about what they wanted to ask. And that will continue on until it's interrupted or until it ends. Pretty much a large part of Dungeons & Dragons or role-playing games could be done without dice at all, because it is just people coming up with a story together, and there doesn't really need to be that many rolls or checks if the story is carrying along. If the Dungeon Master knows what the NPCs within the environment will generally know, then they can give more or less information depending on how they are approached by the players. If the players come in and sort of grab people and demand information, they might then get a scared response, but if they're really nice and really friendly, then they'll get a more friendly response. It's really more a live, interactive storytelling situation where the players and the DM kind of bounce off each other and create this world together. But sooner or later, the dice rolling element of the role-playing game or Dungeons & Dragons will come to effect. And this is usually when you want to simulate some form of chance, some form of potential success or potential failure. So, for example, again, going back to our example town, you're in the town of Greyrock, you hear this odd sound coming from an alleyway off to the right. So a player might say, okay, I want to try to identify where this sound is coming from or what this sound is. Once they've asked a question in that sort of way, then the DM will say, okay, great, then can you give me a skill check? And this will relate to one of the 18 skills that are listed on the character sheet, which are related to different ability scores. So, for example, if you wanted to hear something, that will usually be a perception check, which is quite a common check to come up in most, non-combat D&D situations. And perception basically relates to all your senses, your touch, your taste, your hearing, your sight. So the DM will say, okay, give me a perception roll or wisdom perception roll. The player will roll a d20. They'll check the character sheet and they'll add the modifier, which is the smaller number. So say if your wisdom is 14, that would mean your modifier is +2. And if you're also proficient, if you are skilled in the skill of perception, you might get another +2 on that, so it would be a +4. So let's say this character is proficient in perception. They roll a 20-sided dice, add 4 to it, and whatever that result is, that is their result for the check. Now, while the player is doing this, the DM has either checked the module they've got or checked their own notes, or has just come up on the fly with what the DC for that check that they've just requested is. Now, DC is a difficulty challenge, and this is a set number which the player has to roll equal to or above. And depending on how they roll, this will determine how much information the DM can then share with that player or will share with that player. Now, as I say, the DC or the difficulty class or difficulty challenge can be set in modules. If you're running a module, oftentimes they'll tell you what the DCs of certain checks that are likely to come up are. Or if you're writing your own module, you might have already pre-prepped all the numbers and you know that the checks are going to be these set things. But if it's something that you've not expected to happen, or if it's a random event that's occurred and you're not prepared for it, the player's handbook does have a table on page 174, which tells you the kind of the thresholds for certain difficulty classes. So it generally goes up in jumps of 5. So you've got a DC of 5, which would be a trivial one, then 10 is easy, 15 is moderate, and so on, all the way up to 30, which is like virtually impossible, certainly for lower level characters. And these checks will have to level with the characters because things like proficiency scores go up as you level up. But for a good majority of the early levels, you can pretty much use, say, a 15 for average check, or use a more kind of fluid way of doing it. Like the way I tend to do it is I'm mostly looking for my players to get above 10. If they get below 10, then they've probably not heard or seen or figured out what I want them to figure out. If they get above 10, then they probably have, but depending on how far above 10, I'll give them more or less information. So, for example, this sound down coming from the alleyway, if they got an 11, for example, I'd say, yeah, you can hear that there is definitely something going on coming from this alleyway. It sounds kind of like maybe a scuffle, but you're not really sure much more than that. But if they got, say, a 15 or an 18 or a 20 or above, then I could tell them exactly, okay, well, you hear, there's clearly a fight going on. There's multiple people involved. So I could give them more or less information to help them make a choice after that, once they've done that check. And so once they've got that information, they can then either decide to go into the alleyway, decide to call for help. Again, they can decide to do whatever they want. But basically, that is a large majority of the role-playing part of the game. It's either the players and the DM working together to create a story kind of just by choices and by acting out different events, interspersed with checks that add in a little bit of randomness. So as an example I used in a previous video, if you have a rickety bridge across a chasm and the players want to try to cross it, you might ask for a dexterity saving throw to see whether they fall or not. And you might have planned as the DM that they get across this bridge and the rest of your dungeon or your event continues beyond the bridge. But you should also be aware that if you then allow the opportunity for the dice to come into play, for a check to come into play, then they might fail that check. They might fail it catastrophically with a critical 1, which means basically they kind of have to fall. And once they've fallen, you have to decide on what happens at that point. You're either going to be prepared and you're going to know, okay, right, if they fall into the river, then there'll be a way to climb out just later on and it'll put them into this detour, or it might kill them outright. But you will have to be prepared that the potential that the dice adds in, the chance and the fate that the dice adds in, could completely change the direction of your story. And oftentimes, if you're adding random events in, it can be quite fun to allow them to completely derail a full set story and lead you off in another direction, which you might have to do some improvisation about, or you might have prepared little bits and pieces that you can then reweave into a new story. And this becomes the really fun part of the role-playing games, in that nobody, not even the dungeon master, truly knows how they're going to turn out, because at every time that you ask for a skill check, then basically it becomes a matter of chance. You can weight that chance one way or the other by making it a skill check that you know your players are particularly good at if you want them to pass, or you can weight it in the other direction by making it something that you know they're particularly bad at, and it can, so you're not completely out of control of the game unless you want to play it completely based on chance, but for the most part it becomes quite an exciting, fluid and organic way of generating a story together. And that really is basically the mechanical part of D&D. All you really need to know is how the difficulty class system works and how to add skill checks into your game. And it can actually become easy to forget to add them in. So if you're having a really good role-playing session, you might forget to get players to add a role to convince people, or to perform to people, or to persuade people, particularly if it's more of a conversational situation, because you're having just fun chatting to the player in character, and you might be convinced by what they're saying. But adding a few roles in every now and again can help to stop particularly charismatic players getting more power than the uncharismatic ones, because we are dealing with real people in the end of the day. And some people might really enjoy playing this game and really enjoy having the potential to interact in this fantasy world, but they might personally not have the social flexibility or the social skills to be able to express themselves in the way they want. So it is careful to use the rules, to use the mechanical side of D&D to kind of level the playing field between people who are very good at role-playing and the people who would like to be but prefer the safety of the mechanics and the dice. So you can definitely run a really fun session of Dungeons and Dragons with nothing more than just some dice and paper, but if you want to create an epic, long running story and have a better chance at a fun pace and flow, then extra planning, notes, PDFs, and all that extra stuff becomes more important. But when you're just starting out, I think it's better to get a solid knowledge of the rules and then kind of keep it simple. Follow a module, follow the numbers as set. Don't try to improvise too much unless you are particularly good at that, and just kind of pick the rules up slowly through practice and experience before you start kind of playing around with them and trying to do too much. Because, just coming up with a story between several people is amazing fun. Even just adding one extra person into a storytelling environment creates kind of a multiplication of potential. It's not just two people's minds, it somehow creates an extra whole dimension of worlds that start to become real just on their own. But having said that, just having a kind of role-playing experience between people can be fun, but the reason why the mechanics and the dice and the classes and so on are there is to create a bit of structure and to allow other skills to come into play. Because if every player could literally do anything, you'd be dealing with a very free environment, and it would be fun, but it would be hard to make anything kind of dramatic or narrative happen intentionally. It would be a little bit too random and disorganized. But if you imagine your uncharismatic wizard, for example, who might be able to level an entire army of goblins with their spells, they're particularly good at that area of devastating magic, but they might be really bad at charisma. They might not be a very friendly person, which means that the charming bard character can then swoop in and help get past a door guard who was just not going to let them get into the tavern. And it allows different players to have different specified skill sets, and it's not just everyone trying to do everything all at once. If you are particularly good or particularly bad at something, that means you have to then focus on these specific skills that you're good at, and it allows everyone to fill specific roles and niches, and allows the game to write its own little stories, and for you to feel more invested in your character rather than just you as a person trying to figure out the problem set in front of you. Because if you only ever approach it as you as a person rather than as you playing your character, then it can become quite samey, depending, every game you play becomes just the same thing. Whereas if you start exploring the different characters and using the mechanics of the game, it can create a much more varied experience and a much more balanced experience for everyone. As I was saying before, if you have someone who is particularly charismatic, they might be able to dominate the role-playing side of things without giving anybody else much chance to play or to experience that side of it, just because they are naturally good at that. But if they're limited by the fact that they're playing a massive barbarian who everyone is scared of, then that might help other less charismatic in themselves players experience the ability to be more charismatic within the game. And I think that's one of the real benefits of the role-playing tabletop sort of games, is that you can explore completely different personalities and do it in a kind of safe environment. Now, once we've kind of covered the role-playing side of things, we have to move into combat, which is where the rules become really quite important and the game changes quite significantly.